It's easy to gaze back on the long history of England with a sense of ordered inevitability in the sequence of events and the progression of familiar great men and women. However, even such iconic figures as Alfred the Great did not necessarily have their legacy as we know it written in stone. Today we focus on the events surrounding the succession of Alfred's son and heir, Edward, commonly known today as the Elder. Alfred, of course, had an unlikely rise to the throne of Wessex himself. The last of Æthelwold's sons, he succeeded his elder brother and fought continuously before and after Eddington to secure his kingdom and even expand West Saxon influence into much of Mercia. By around 886, Alfred was known as King of the Anglo-Saxons rather than just King of Wessex, and Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, was just that, Lord and not a king. In the darkest days of the Danish menace, none of Alfred's predecessors could have dreamed of such power, yet in 899 it was not indisputable who would succeed. Edward, of course, was Alfred's elder son, and the natural choice, was he not? Well, not so fast. The key to understanding the events of Edward's disputed succession lie in his father's own rise to the throne. In 871, Alfred was the obvious choice for the Witan, given the existential crisis at the time. The Danes had already battered the West Saxon forces in a series of battles in which Alfred and his brother had tasted sweet victory, but also bitter defeat. Indeed, it was perhaps at Meriton that King Ethelred himself suffered the wounds that would eventually kill him in early 871. Ethelred, though, was not without sons. The æthelings Ethelhelm and Æthelwold lived, but their uncle Alfred succeeded for three key reasons. Firstly, an agreement made at Swinbjorg a few months before that stated whichever brother survived the other would inherit the property left to both of them by their father, King Æthelwald. Both boys were also underage and untested, not a good choice for the Witan in a time of war. Alfred, the so-called Wild Boar of Ashdown, had bloodied himself multiple times already. Finally, father-to-son inheritance was by no means set in stone. Alfred's own ætheling status as the son of King Ethelwald made him a perfectly viable candidate. However, as events would show, what was good for the goose was also good for the gander. Though accepting the Witan's decision as the years progressed, it's clear Ethelred's surviving son, Ethelwald, had not forgotten his own throne-worthiness. It's likely Ethelwald's own hopes for the succession were not dampened early on, even by the birth of Edward in around 874. Indeed, Alfred was not an absolutist monarch in the later sense of the term, and the Witan may have insisted he acknowledge Ethelwald as favoured successor during the 880s for the same reasons he had succeeded. By the middle 890s though, the political landscape shifted again. Edward was now a young man, and it's clear that Alfred aggressively promoted Edward as his preferred and natural successor. In his will, the king gave the majority of his lands and property to Edward, with his nephew receiving just a few estates. In addition, the king filled the Witan with his own allies, including his son-in-law Ethelred and his brother-in-law Æthelwald, a Mercian ealdorman. As well as smoothing the path politically for Edward, the ætheling also began taking the reins militarily, fighting in the continuing conflict with the Danes throughout the 890s and gaining valuable military experience. In 899, Edward therefore succeeded Alfred, but not without incident. Ethelwald moved immediately, seizing the royal estates of Wimborne and Christchurch, holding up in the former, apparently with a nun he had abducted from her convent, and here, he declared, he would live or die. However, as events unfolded, he would actually do neither. Ethelwald's choice of Wimborne to make his initial stand was intended to highlight his own claim, given his father King Ethelred was buried there. The newly minted King Edward was very much his father's son, however, and unmoved by this, marched the feared to nearby Badbury Rings. Æthelwold took the hint and escaped after nightfall. Æthelwold headed north to the Danes of Northumbria, who recognised him there as king. The Danes had a history of using puppets to secure influence, and it may have also seemed useful to them to have an alternative claimant to the West Saxon throne in their collective pockets. Meanwhile, Edward had been successfully elected, but consecration and coronation would further solidify his position should his cousin return with a larger following. Edward's coronation took place on 8th of June 900 at Kingston upon Thames, a significant location given its location between the traditional West Saxon and Mercian kingdoms. A symbolic location then, to emphasise unity. Plegmont, Archbishop of Canterbury, performed the ceremony, meaning that, in theory at least, only death or the Pope could remove him from power. In the autumn of 901, Æthelwold returned with a fleet and landed in Essex. In 902, he persuaded the Danes of East Anglia to break the peace with Wessex and back his march into Mercia up to Cricklade. He then crossed the Thames to harry Wessex itself. King Edward did not immediately confront his cousin, instead gathering his levies and counter-invading East Anglia. Long gone were the days when the Danes were mobile and able to strike anywhere and mount back into the sea within hours. Edward targeted their lands in retribution. Edward's counterattack provoked his enemies' withdrawal back to defend their own lands. Satisfied, Edward then similarly ordered his own hosts' withdrawal, though it appears that not everybody got the message. The Danes confronted a Kentish force from Edward's army on the 13th of December 902 at the Holme. The fighting was brutal and hard fought, the Danes suffering slightly more casualties than their foes. However, they eventually kept the place of slaughter, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Anglo-Saxon dead included an abbot, some king's thanes, and most notably the alderman of Kent himself, Sidghow, whose daughter would actually eventually marry Edward. Though on paper a Danish victory, the Holme fits snugly into the Pyrrhic category, since both the East Anglian king and Æthelwold himself were counted among the dead. So ended Æthelwold's revolt. Of course, how much of a threat this pretender was is up for debate. Edward's succession was overall a smooth one. However, given the later invasion, it's fair to say Edward was suitably anxious to crush his cousin, if nothing else because he served as a viable nexus of Danish opposition, with his war with the Danes destined to dominate the rest of his quarter-century reign.